The US Air Force intends to retire its fleet of F-22 Raptors just as soon as it has enough of its next-generation air dominance fighters in service to replace them. But what does that mean will actually happen to these dominant air superiority fighters? After all, despite the fact that they've been flying for more than a quarter century, today's F-22s are still widely considered to be the most capable air superiority fighter on the planet. And today's F-22s are in the midst of an $11 billion upgrade that promises to make them dominant for another decade plus to come. So what will America do with its retiring F-22s? First of all, let's talk about why the F-22 is being retired in the first place, because it has less to do with capability and more to do with production volume. Originally, the US Air Force intended to buy at least 750 of Lockheed Martin's F-22 Raptors, the first ever truly fifth-generation fighters. But by 2006, the US was embroiled in the global war on terror in multiple theaters, and the F-22 program, which was aimed at deterring near-peer threats that the US just didn't see on the horizon, was ultimately canceled in favor of freeing up budget for those ongoing combat operations. As a result, the US only actually received around 186 F-22s out of that 750 Raptor order, and only around 150 of those were actually equipped with all the combat systems they'd need to get into the fight. As a result, America's F-22 fleet has been destined for a short service life, because not only are there not more Raptors to replace airframes as they age out of service, but a lot of the F-22's supply chain and infrastructure was all reallocated toward the F-35, making it exceedingly expensive to get things like replacement parts. As a result, the F-22 is living on borrowed time, despite the fact that it really has few, if any, actual peers on the world stage. Now, the Air Force did explore restarting F-22 production back in 2017, but the immense cost of doing so made them recognize that they'd be better off developing and fielding an all-new stealth fighter that was even more capable. And that's what we got in the Next Generation Air Dominance program. The Air Force now intends to field this new air superiority fighter by around 2030, which is when they think the F-22 will no longer be quite as dominant as it is today. Now, that genuinely doesn't mean the F-22 won't be any good by 2030. Instead, it just means that it'll be so expensive to maintain that it won't really be worth it with newer and even better fighters on the roster. But that does beg the question, what does Uncle Sam intend to do with those 150 or so combat-ready Raptors once they finally do retire? Some have wondered if they might be put on the foreign market, sold to an allied nation in need of advanced air superiority platforms. But I can tell you right off the bat that the answer there is almost certainly no. Not just because you'd need to literally pass legislation to lift the export ban on the F-22, but also because any allied nation would face the same economic issues with maintaining that fleet of even older Raptors at that point. It would just cost a fortune to produce the infrastructure required to build replacement parts and whatever else you'd need to keep these Raptors flying on a regular basis for decades to come. The value just wouldn't really be there for these nations that are already involved in programs like Tempest or the FCAS. I've also been asked if F-22s will find their way to the private market, the way we've seen with a handful of F-16s and a number of older or foreign platforms like MiG-29s or F-4s, and the answer there is also almost certainly no. The F-22 Raptor is, after all, an extremely advanced stealth aircraft, meaning the technology found in its material science, overall design, avionics, and so forth are all largely still classified, and you'd have to strip all that away from the aircraft in order to sell it to anyone outside the defense apparatus, meaning all a private buyer could really get their hands on would potentially be a pile of scraps. So what about the Boneyard in Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona? If you're not familiar with the Boneyard, it's a massive 2,600-acre facility where many retired US Air Force airframes go to live out their twilight years, or at least to take a break. Many tend to think of the Boneyard as where airframes go to die, and for some it may be, but for many others, it's just a stopping point before components from one airframe are pulled and sent to other still operational aircraft, and sometimes complete airframes are even pulled out of retirement at the Boneyard and sent back into service. In fact, we even saw that with the B-52 back in 2019. Now, all of the aircraft stored at Davis-Monthan fall under the responsibility of the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, and they sort all of their platforms into one of four types of storage. The vast majority of these stored airframes are kept in Type 2000, 3000, or 4000 storage. Each of these types categorizes different degrees of flyability, if you will, with Type 2000 representing aircraft that can be cannibalized for parts, often called canbirds. Aircraft in Type 3000 storage are temporary stays. They're kept in good flying condition to be transferred elsewhere. And Type 4000 can sort of be thought of as the aircraft that are sent there for cemetery services. More often than not, they're much older platforms that are unlikely to see a return to service, though it could potentially happen. But the smallest storage category is undoubtedly Type 1000 storage, which represents only about 10% of the 4,400 or so aircraft kept in the Davis-Monthan Boneyard. Now, this is the type of storage in which you'd find America's remaining fleet of 50 or so F-117 Nighthawks, which actually represents the majority of Nighthawk airframes ever built. These F-117s are not stored on Davis-Monthan, however, they're stored at the Tonopah Test Range, but the concept holds in either location. The Air Force keeps these F-117s in climate-controlled storage hangars in as close to flyable condition as possible so that they can be returned to service at any point if the US finds itself in a fight that would warrant it. And in fact, over the years, we have seen lots of Nighthawks get pulled out of Type 1000 storage and used for a wide variety of military exercises, sometimes filling in for adversary fifth-generation fighters like China's J-20 or Russia's Su-57, and other times standing in for low-observable weapons like airborne cruise missiles to give F-15s practice chasing cruise missiles down and taking them out before they can find their targets inside American territory. Now, back in 2017, the Air Force did announce plans to begin retiring and demilitarizing these F-117 airframes held in storage at a rate of around 4 per year, and it looks as though at least a handful of them really have been fully demilitarized and pulled apart. But the vast majority of this fleet is still believed to be intact, and for good reason. Despite the fact that the F-117 entered service all the way back in 1983, it is still stealthier by a wide margin than the vast majority of tactical aircraft in service today. And the F-22 Raptor, once it does head into retirement maybe a decade or so from now, will almost certainly join it in that Type 1000 storage. In fact, we may even see F-117s demilitarized and retired in favor of creating more room to store more F-22s as they begin to trickle out of service. Now, it's important to remember that just because NGAD is expected to replace the F-22 as America's premier air superiority fighter by 2030, that doesn't mean the Raptor will be retired by then. In fact, F-22s will all but certainly continue to fly for years to come, but in a reduced capacity in order to retain as many hours as possible on their airframes. Now, F-22s are rated for 8,000 total flight hours, and that can obviously be stretched out with service life extension programs. But the Air Force would certainly like to replace its F-22s as quickly as possible, especially if NGAD really does outperform the Raptor in a number of important metrics. The truth is, it's just cheaper to maintain a smaller number of different types of aircraft. But nonetheless, the Raptor is just far too capable to be sent out to pasture prematurely, and there is certain to be ongoing debate about how many Raptors are retired at what type of rate as NGAD fighters enter service. This is the sort of debate that really always happens when aircraft are being replaced by a new generation of platform, especially one as beloved and as broadly capable as the F-22. So what really will happen to America's F-22s once they're retired? Well, they won't really be retired. Instead, they'll be kept in good flying condition to be used for a wide variety of training exercises to simulate advanced adversary technologies, or maybe even to jump back into the fight if the US finds itself in a large-scale conflict that could require the use of added stealth airframes. In short, heroes get remembered, but legends never die.